And everybody should have received materials from Jenna last week. The agenda for today's meeting has three main topics. Sort of one, which is really updates related to sort of timeline between now and December of this year, and some key pieces that we wanted to flag for you all in terms of work process and how things are progressing. Some time to discuss that, get feedback from you all. And then brief updates on four key topics. So the HCP, the FMP, the carbon RFP, and Shutter Creek. Depending on how long that takes, we've allocated up to 1 hour and 20 minutes. May or may not need that full allocation of time. And depending on that, we'll take a break or not in there before taking on the topic of startup funding. So we'll, I think with Brett and Shannon kind of give an overview of legislative session, bridge budget, and then some real pieces for you all to be thinking about as a board that start to come up the end of this year and into next year, and start to get your minds thinking about that. So related to the ED and staff hiring, project planning, implementation, budgeting, and startup costs, as well as starting to think already about the 24 legislative session. So we won't have decision points or anything like that. We're still a prospective board, but want to make sure that you all are thinking not just about the stuff that's coming right in front of you, but also some of those things that are a little further out on the horizon.
Hey, Peter, can I steal you hit on a couple topics I'd like to bring up real quickly, if you don't mind. I'll take 2 minutes and I'll get out of everybody's way. And I think it's time that this prospective board begins kind of acting more like a board in the sense of running meetings and establishing agenda. So that's a lot of the timeline stuff. We can't just do it on December or January 1st. And so I'm going to throw out to all of you a suggestion that by October 1st, or by the meeting in October, excuse me, with all due respect to Peter and everything he has done, that we run the meeting. And that means that by October 1st, we need a board structure. We need a chair or a president and a vice chair or vice president. And we hit the ground running in January with at least a couple of months of members running the meeting and establishing agenda and so forth. So with that, I mean, that's my suggestion. I'll be glad to any comments you want, or you can type them in or tell me I'm stupid. And what I would suggest then is that by the August meeting, if you all have suggestions, I know I do, but if you have suggestions on who we ought to have chair us or during our first year in existence, and perhaps a vice chair, if you guys would all agree, then I think you run those to Peter, and we can come back in August and discuss the people who've been nominated in that sense, and begin to arrive at a leadership structure, and this prospective board beginning to act more like a board or run its own meeting. So I was slightly over 2 minutes. I apologize. But that's what I'd like to suggest and get a little bit of feedback right now, because it meets some of the things Peter was talking about, certainly timeline and board actions in the future. So if the board is amiable to that, I really think it's time, or the prospective board, thank you. I think it's really time that we begin to take over some of those functions.
Thanks for jumping straight into it, Keith. It's great. And the last topic on the agenda, and I'll see if there are reactions, is really around management implementation, operational examples. And that also is one of those things that's kind of looking out into early 2024. So more and more of those topics are coming before you all. So with that, I'll pause and see if board members, prospective board members, have any thoughts on what Keith's put on the table. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I very much support Keith's suggestion that just the need and opportunity, I think, for us to find ways to have more of a deliberative conversation. I think having more of a structure in terms of having folks who can be working on, helping shape the agendas, as well as moving the conversation forward would be really helpful to start with over the fall. So just want to say I support that, and be it, prospective chair, vice chair, prospective co-chairs, potentially for a while, but I think it's a great idea to have more of that structure to allow us to facilitate conversations amongst the board. So thanks, Keith, for raising that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Mike?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and essentially start working as a practice run for when we do become a full-fledged board. So good idea.
Thanks, Mike. Bob?
Yeah, I agree with it too, but I think with the caveat that I think having a facilitator is a valuable thing too. And I think especially as we continue to have to negotiate some of these things out, I think having somebody running the trap lines and being responsible for that, in addition to whoever the chair is, I think will be helpful for a while.
Yeah, oops. With apologies, but I actually meant to include that, Bob, that certainly we're going to need that facilitator presence even early into the year. So thanks for bringing that up, and my apologies for leaving that part out.
Thanks, Bob. Keith? Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd agree, especially with the idea that we're going to have a facilitator. Peter, we're not going to let you off that easy. There's, if for no other reason, it was something I was going to bring up later, that I think there are things, very important things, that we are ignoring, or at best minimizing. Number one being the budget, the financial viability. The last meeting we had, we were the best case scenario that they presented was it's $1 million a year underwater. $1 million, and that's before you consider, which they hadn't, that in the early years there's going to be a high percentage of hemlock. So you're probably looking at $1.2 million, $1,300,000 underwater. So we need to emphasize that, and we need to keep that in mind with everything that we're doing. And I just think that we're continuing down a path, making decisions with the idea that this is financially viable. And I'm here to tell you it isn't. And it's a big deal, and we're minimizing it, and we need to be making decisions with that in mind, unless somebody's got a silver bullet that I'm unaware of. But we need to figure out how to deal with that and make decisions accordingly.
Thanks, Paul. And that financial subgroup, just so everybody's aware, did meet between this meeting and the previous one, and we'll meet again between this meeting and your August meeting to continue to dig into those, sort of financial budget topics, and work to address those. So, and we'll have more time on upcoming agendas for the full board to dig into that. So appreciate you flagging it. Jack?
So just, I agree with the suggestion as well. And, particularly with having Peter being able to facilitate, I think it's important. I think it would be really good to have that kind of chair, vice chair structure available, and maybe to look at the agenda for the meetings a little bit more. That seems logical to me. But I don't think we should let Peter off the hook either. But yeah, I certainly support the idea.
Thanks, Jack. Shannon?
Yeah, didn't want to jump in and distract from the conversation, but just to Paul's note, we do need to continue looking at the financial analysis and the budgeting. The spreadsheet that we looked at the last financial meeting, and the line item that was highlighted that showed $1 million less, was based on a budget of 5.3 million for the forest and $1 million for the authority. So it's a total budget of 6.3 million. So I just wanted to just describe that for the full group so you know what we're all talking about. And a big part of that is looking at the budget side of the equation too, which Paul is right. We still need to continue to look at both sides of the equation together.
Thanks, Shannon. Appreciate you flagging that. Prospective board members, and not to call you out in particular, Melissa, but and Tom, you all have any thoughts you'd like to share? I just haven't heard from you yet on this topic.
Yes, I totally agree with that notion, and with you continuing to serve as a facilitator, I think that's a great suggestion. Keith, thank you for bringing it up. And and I was gonna jump in with the same thing that Shannon shared. There's more to the budget than was just suggested, and there's definitely more to discuss and more to work on there, but it's not so simple as it's $1 million in the red. But yeah, more to work on that front.
Thanks, Tom. Melissa?
I'm fine with us starting to function as a board and keeping Peter as a facilitator. I don't have any strong energy on this topic. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. With that, I'm going to actually go ahead and turn us to the agenda. And actually, before I do that, just Keith, you made a suggestion in terms of a process here. And I'll just emphasize that if folks have suggestions for prospective board members, they would either like to nominate as a chair, vice chair, co-chair, or if you'd like to self-nominate, why don't you send those suggestions to me? Do so in advance of the August meeting. Due respect to Keith's timeline, maybe October is the right timeline. But for me, I think as soon as you all are, given sort of the fact that y'all are kind of unanimous in your thought about this, I know Colin's not here and we'll make sure to check with him as well. But I think the sooner we can have board member engagement and agenda development, et cetera, the better. So we'll do that as expeditiously as possible. If you have recommendations, nominations, go ahead and send them via email to me, and we'll try to get that on the agenda for either August or September. All right, with that, you got with your materials a timeline, and we're going to turn our attention to that timeline. I think we can share screen, but Brett and Shannon, I think you're on point for much of this agenda today, this topic included, and I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Okay, I think the starting point is, and Shannon and I will go back and forth on this, is we wanted to get you all a revised timeline, an overall project timeline, not just for one piece like they have that conservation plan, but for all of the workflow pieces. And so Jen, I can bring it up from my screen, or if you have it handy, do you mind pulling it up?
Sure, I can pull it up real quick.
Or actually, hold on. I think, sorry. I think it might be easier because then I can, with my cursor, do the hovering over things, and it'll be obvious to people. Let me, sorry, one sec. Let me pull it up here. So what we don't want to do is go through every single cell on this timeline, and it would take a long time. So, all right, here we go. And so the hope is that you've had time to read through or look at it in advance of this meeting and do a little familiarization with it. And then in the timeline itself, just holler at me if it's not on your screen right now. I've used red to highlight certain marks on the horizon, and this is a work in, first off, this is a work in progress. That's why it says draft, because putting together all of the process pieces across the whole Elliott State Research is not easy, and we've all been around our different schedules. And so Shannon, thank you for the OSU coordination, and then Jen and Paul as well. This may change based on feedback, and it's not intended as a static document. And we'll bring it back again at the follow-up meeting in August. But we haven't seen this since really February of last year. And as you all know, a lot has changed and continues to change. And so we wanted to bring this back with an updated version. And in red are the kind of major marks on the horizon that I thought we'd touch on really quick. And in those marks in red, though, are not necessarily things that as prospective board members you'll be doing, as in like voting or putting the work into. There are things, though, on the horizon that are either known or questioned, especially when the board becomes a full board tied to the new State Research Forest Authority, where you can vote. So marks in January, which kind of as a theme, they're in green, as a theme for this meeting. It's a lot. This meeting will be a lot about how you all want to be set up between now and January to act on things when January comes around. So I thought what we could do, Shannon, is just kind of hit in our respective areas, OSU and DSL. I'll maybe start with DSL. I was just going to hit on some of these key marks on the horizon, just so you all are aware of where the key dates are as prospective board members, and then leave a little bit of question and answer time, Peter, in case I think that's really what we want to know, is this is for you all, and we want to be clear about what's on the windshield and what's on the horizon. So for the HCP, okay.
Hey, Brett, in case folks didn't see in the chat, if you're having trouble viewing this, the small cells on your screen under view options at the top of your screen, you can increase the size of the screen so you can zoom in.
Yeah, I'll do a little better. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so for the HCP, the main date that is kind of do or die is the date tied to Senate Bill 1546, or now 161, around getting a draft of the HCP submitted to the services, which is one of the key enabling actions for the research forest and the authority to be able to exist. So that's in December, but the other main dates I'd highlight on this are come early September. This is when we need to get the revised draft in, and then there's a period of time where the services review it, and we get to that point of further analysis, making sure all the writing in the revised draft checks out, and then finalizing the HCP for submission in either late November or December. And then from there, the NEPA side of the equation takes over around finalizing the environmental impact statement, and then getting things ready for a record of decision and eventual permits for take under the Endangered Species Act in June. So the timeline has a lot more detail on what leads up to that and the pieces in between, and we can talk through any questions, but that's that piece. Other pieces related, everything kind of interrelates around financial planning, and the Senate Bill 1546 requirement that DSL Director Vicky issue a financial viability conclusion by the statutory deadline of December 31. We have that pegged at November, where Vicky, as DSL director, would be issuing a letter regarding financial viability. And that implies a lot of work, including the financial plan that Senate Bill 1546 speaks to from OSU, and the variety of work that's happening now in the financial subgroup, as well as additional work around the analysis that needs to happen between now and November. The land board the land board assistants have indicated an interest in October land board update. So right now, the one thing on the land board horizon is acting on the forest management plan, which would be at their December meeting on December 11th, if I have it right. Or 12th, I think. That would be the only stop that we currently have on the or that we had on the timeline. The land board assistants have indicated a desire to hear about the Elliott again in October, though, not as an action item, but as an update item. And part of it we've heard is based on there are 2 new land board members. They haven't heard anything about the Elliott yet. For us just to come in December when they have an action item and a vote on the FMP. Well, we don't want to lose focus on that. It wouldn't in and of itself speak to all the other things that are happening on the Elliott, like a status update on the HCP, where things stand on financial viability. And so there's an interest in hearing an update around pieces on the Elliott in October. So that's in this timeline at the October 10th land board meeting. The other DSL related pieces, let me hit Shutter Creek real quick. We'll get into this in the updates to come, but this is the other big DSL piece right now. And so the marks on the horizon, really, I don't have anything in red here, but there is a date come August 1st where DSL through Vicky needs to sign or not sign GSA documents related to moving forward with the transfer of Shutter Creek to DSL. So that's in here in August. And then a lot of the remainder of Shutter Creek relates to fundraising as part of the startup costs, overall startup costs for the enterprise here. But visioning, planning out what the development plan for Shutter Creek would look like, and then raising funds around it is kind of the timeline there. Shannon, we could probably talk budgets together, I guess. And I think the only thing I'd say on this one is, well, Paul teed it up. There's a lot, come the board, becoming a board in January of 2024. There's a lot of work that potentially needs to get done around the 2024 legislative session. And, we'll get into what money came out of this session in a bit here during this meeting, but whether and how the authority is set up to go back into the legislative session in 2024 to get more money, whether it be for immediate budget around forest operations and research or the larger startup costs, that's something that's going to take a lot of advanced work. And so it's highlighted on here as, assuming the authority is going to need to pass its own budget, which in turn relates to a term sheet agreement with OSU, there's a lot of work that needs to go into getting ready for that. But the board action in January would be, if you want to be timely with the legislative session, sooner the better around budget preparation. But the first time the board could act in a way that's timely with the legislative session is in January. And so that's marked here. And then related to that is something else we'll talk about later in this meeting today is what other revenue do you all want to make sure is being projected related to the financial viability requirements of Senate Bill 1546. And it's not so much a whether harvest revenue is projected, it's a when question. And so that's flagged on here as a conversation about demonstration projects, kind of early term management on the Elliott. The last bits from the DSL end, I think, are the carbon project RFP. We'll get in, I'll leave that for, Bill's going to do a brief overview update in a few minutes here. I don't have anything in terms of board action on this highlighted in this this timeline document yet, because it really depends on what happens after phase 1 of the current RFP, and the statute reserves the board authority the right to decide whether you're going to sell any carbon credits, and that decision hasn't been reached. So if and when that happens, it'll go on this timeline somewhere, but there's not enough intel or info on that yet. The executive director hire, maybe I'll just touch on this one question, and it's something that OSU that we could probably both speak to, but just to take one more off the list. The assumption here is the executive director hire it's enough of a key component of this whole thing working that our assumption in putting the revised timeline together is you all probably want to do it as soon as you're legally able to do it. And that wouldn't be until January. But in order to get the process set up around hiring, there's a lot of work that probably that would need to be done between now and January to get that ready. And so Jenna's been doing some work on, and DSL's provided a state form position description for an agency director. Our thinking is after this meeting, we can circulate with you all a revised position description that's based on your former, or I should say previous input on what qualifications and responsibilities you would see in that position. So we can circulate that after this meeting, but that's part of what would need to get set up and done, and then circulated through a hiring process that the statute names OSU as running, leading up to a board decision on the director in January. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shannon. I think the thing for you all, probably grokked it already, but the last line, the last row in this timesheet or timeline is basically what we're going to be doing, or what you all want to be sure we're doing at which upcoming board meetings between now and January. So Shannon, I can turn over the screen to you if that helps.
Yeah, and Brett, while you're doing that, and Shannon, before you start, I'll just pause briefly and see if there are any clarifying questions, comments from the board, and then we'll take this piece, and then Shannon will do the same after you've walked through your pieces. If that's okay. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the chute, and I see a lot of it interfering with other things in the chute and getting jammed up. The contract with OSU is going to dictate a whole bunch of things. Who the executive director works for. I think the board, or the interim board, or whatever we're calling ourselves. I'm just going to call us the board. So fill in however you want to do it. The board has an idea of what and who we think the executive director is working for. OSU has another idea, and they're different. These things will have a big impact on the budget, and who decides which part of the budget is the responsibility of which entity. So we need to get that sorted out before we get too much further down the track, so it isn't something that changes the decision that we've made as far as hiring an executive director. So I think we need to be very careful about the order of these things. They're not all simultaneous. Some things need to happen before others.
Thanks, Paul. You're not wrong. There's a lot to do. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, the thing that gives me a little heartburn on this is really the FMP, just because it seemed to be kind of cranking along. I'm sure there's been work going on behind the scenes, but when we got stuck working back on the HCP. It seemed to have gone a little bit dormant. And the last time I really paid attention to it, there was still a lot of unfinished parts. We're supposed to have that kind of in a public review draft form by the end of this month, and then out for public comment. It sounds like at least public information sessions in August. So I just wonder about kind of the very short-term timeline on that, of kind of reconnecting and getting ready for that. It seems like there's still a little bit of room for work between ourselves before it goes out for public review.
Yeah, that's, I think, something that Shannon will talk about as she goes through sort of the more OSU oriented portions of this timeline, but it is certainly something that folks are thinking about in terms of the amount of work to get that done and ready for public input. Shannon, before you go to that, I'll just pause briefly and see if there are any other comments or questions from the prospective board members. And I failed to say this at the outset of the meeting. I think most people are accustomed to our protocols here, but just in case not, conversation is focused really among the board members and key staff folks. If you are a member of the public and want to make comments, we've got time at the end of the agenda for that, specifically dedicated. It's tentatively, pending how the agenda rolls out, for approximately 3:45. If you want to make comments to the board, feel free to send me or Jenna a chat and we'll make sure to get you in the queue. And just know that depending on how the agenda rolls out, that time may shift forward or backward just a little bit. With that, and not seeing any hands raised, I'll turn it over to you, Shannon.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Go ahead and share the timeline again. So I'll touch on a couple of the other things that are more in OSU's court. Number one is the FMP, and this gets to some of the comments that Bob just made. And so we have been continuing to work on the FMP. You'll notice here again, as Brett pointed out, we have this December 12th land board action on the FMP, on the final, working backwards from there. As Bob noted, a lot of energy has gone into the HCP revisions and the conversations and analysis that we've been going through together over the past couple of months. At the same time, we have also been working on edits to existing sections as well as new sections. So looking to December and backing that up, we are looking at a public comment period on a full version of the FMP draft, an updated version in October, with final edits happening in November, and then a final version of the management plan ahead of the December meeting. There are a couple of public listening sessions noted here ahead of that public comment period, which will last for several weeks, and we'll have written comments and a pathway for those to be brought into the FMP process at this stage, similar to what we did last year, but in a more formal and final version. We have a public listening session that we'll have in August and then another in September. And I'll give it more of an update in a couple of minutes on that as part of this update section. In addition to that, and this level of detail is not currently in this draft timeline, we're working on sections of the management plan that either have not been released yet as part of previous drafts, or have had some significant updates. Sharing those publicly ahead of that comment period in October, as well as working with board members on those sections, in particular, the chapter on governance, which ties very closely with the term sheet conversations that have been happening, and management agreements. So that level of detail is not reflected here, but it is part of these next couple of months leading up to the public version of the FMP, the updated version, and that comment period. Just scrolling down a little bit, looking at the OSU management agreement or term sheet, there have been some internal discussions with the prospective board. Coming up in August, we have a meeting scheduled with members of the OSU team and that subgroup. And then you'll see an update to the prospective board in September, all leading to this item flagged in red in November of having a draft ready. And part of this timing is, as Paul noted, a lot of these things are very closely tied together, and certain items need to be addressed before we get to this point. But then also the OSU Board of Trustees would need to sign off on OSU's participation in the Elliott State Research Forest. And so having a draft ready of this agreement prior to that board meeting in December is an important piece for them. We'll talk more about startup costs later on in the meeting. OSU Board of Trustee approval is another line down here. So you'll note mid-December, there will be that special board meeting and a vote on participation. And this is one of the pieces of Senate Bill 1546. There are also several other points for updates leading up to that meeting with the OSU board, including an update at the August 25th meeting, an update in October at the Board of Trustees meeting, and then OSU receiving the information that's needed for the board vote in November ahead of that meeting in December. And I think those are the major ones. I think, Brett, you covered most everything else in this timeline, but happy to go back in further detail on any of these or discuss more.
Any comments or questions? Okay, well, needless to say, the teams will be working very hard between now and the end of this calendar year on a daily basis. There are many conversations, many meetings, and a lot of work happening. Go ahead, Paul.
I guess I might as well ask it here. The letter from Vicky regarding the financial viability. What goes into a yes? And is a yes dependent on a yes from the board, prospective board?
Well, that's a good question, the latter part of your question. I hadn't considered that. It's the department's recommendation. I plan on taking in all kinds of information. Dan Newton is one of them because we hired Dan to give me an assessment. I'll be asking him for an update. I suspect that your voice as a board is going to be critical to that conversation. So the answer is quite a number of things, Paul. And I would tell you too that my recommendation may include some things that say that in order to meet financial viability, the authority should probably do this or that before we turn over the forest. One of those might be, as we'll hear from Bill, might be carbon as a backup financial plan. The other one is the requirement that you accept the HCP.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah, and on
Any
that,
other? Go
well,
ahead,
Peter,
Brett.
I think what Paul, I mean, just adding on Vicky to what you said, I mean, I think, Paul, you're getting at something where like how you all part of the timeline is how you all want to be showing up as a board during the kind of big moments, whether it be state land board vote or OSU Board of Trustees vote. And the work group, I mean, not just the financial subgroup, work group effort, but how the board feeds into the other big Senate Bill 1546 action around we're talking about financial viability. So I think I imagine everybody at the higher board level, land board included, would want to know how this board is feeling when time comes.
I think that's why we're going to make a presentation to the land board in October, so we can give them a sense of what to expect in December. As Brett mentioned, there are 2 new land board members, and while I've discussed the Elliott with Governor Kotek and provided her with an overview, I think she's not had an opportunity to ask questions of the board, the prospective board, and of course we have a new Secretary of State. So October will be devoted to a number of updates and opportunities for you to be present and answer questions that would be directed to you all. Mostly those interactions are between me and the board, but also we can have folks in the audience that I can invite up and participate in those conversations. We haven't quite fleshed out our October meeting agenda. We just decided last week that October is where we wanted to put a number of those things. We're going to want to update the board on Shutter Creek, any of our fundraising that we've been doing. There's quite a bit, and I don't want to leave it all until December. And your financial subgroup is going to help determine what this prospective board is going to feel comfortable with going forward. And that's going to be very critical to my analysis, as is Dan Newton's analysis.
Thanks, Vicky. Jennifer, you went up and then back down?
Yeah, I went down because my dog started barking. But that's okay. He moved to another room. Yeah, I was just picking up on this and going back to the timeline and maybe some of the things we talked about earlier. It seems like taking that last line of this timeline on the board, the role of the board, and like having someone, not today, but maybe after today, kind of really expand that out and show the interconnections and the timelines and the input points, to your point, Brett, to all these other pieces of the timeline, because I think that can then help ensure that in each month, what the board is actually spending time focusing on ties into those decision points and the other ones. And I think it does at a large scale, but I think it would be helpful, I think, for us to see how our timeline really connects into all of the other lines on the grid.
Great suggestion, Jennifer. We can work on that. All right, anything else before we move on to a few other substantive updates? Okay, Brett, why don't you go ahead and take on the HCP?
What do you mean that? I've been wrestling with it. Hi again, everybody. I will deliver an update on the HCP and try to keep it brief because this is in the update section of the agenda. So I'm going to share one slide. I promise not to do what you all saw and experienced at the last board meeting, which was a much deeper dive on the HCP revisions. So let me see if I can get to the right slide. Okay. Can everybody see this slide, the revisions to allocations slide? Or can anybody not see it? Let me just put it that way. Okay, I'll keep going. So the HCP, and this in part relates to the timeline that we distributed, the overall workflow on all the workflow pieces timeline. The HCP specifically, so we've handed over, handed over as applicant the list of revisions. to be made to the HCP, to the federal services. We've got pending or unresolved pieces in a couple areas I'll touch on in a minute, but basically that list was handed over following the Prospective Board's January 6th meeting, where it was a long set of presentations and robust back and forth, and yes, to keep to the timeline of landing at the HCP finalized and handed over by December 31st. We needed to keep moving on the revisions. And so the upshot is this is the summary level of what we handed over around the revisions coming out of the June 6th meeting. So you can see them all. There are application changes that affect, I mean, part of the message, I guess, to you all is while the fundamentals of the research and the research design proposal are what we're trying to keep intact, there have been some fairly significant changes, and maybe not as significant as some would like, but part of it relates to the addition of new covered activities and harvest types, which ties to these three new categories: the MRW volume replacement, which are the purple on the map. Those are the Upper Big Creek and Alder Creek areas that would serve as extensive areas to locate extensive harvest acres to offset any further impacts on extensives in the MRW from the murrelet conservation changes that we're making. The second is the MRW flexible category, which is the goldish yellow around the perimeter or the periphery of the Elliott. Those are the former MRW partials, now the flexibles. And then flexible extensive, the third bullet around the new covered activity harvest type, it's a chunk. I won't even bother to, it's in that southwest corner of the Elliott where Palouse Creek is, and it's 150 acres of, you know, what's in the MRW flexible category that would only be managed as extensive and not open to all of the flexible forestry or harvest types that the rest of the MRW flexible is open to. And that relates to it being older, more heterogeneous existing forest structure that's still outside of species habitat. As its own category for clarity of analysis and future management. So that would result from moving the NS spotted owl 46 circle to abandoned. Uh-oh, I'm getting an unstable internet connection. Am I all right, Peter?
Yeah, it's occasionally glitchy. Maybe go off camera and see if that helps just a little bit. It's not terrible, but it is a little glitchy.
Okay. All right. Let me one sec here. Okay. So the second big addition or big change is around bringing East Hackey Ridge and how East Hackey will be managed into the HCP. So that's a mix of reserve acreage, and then the bulk of what was previously analyzed as intensive would be allocated to extensive. And there are boundary changes to the management research watershed and the conservation CRW in order to accommodate these new allocations. So basically shrinking the CRW in areas to carve out the MRW volume replacement polygons or area, portions of subwatersheds, and then other portions of the CRW that have been moved into MRW flexible, where they were less than 65 and didn't have covered species encumbrances, and then a portion of the former MRW that was reserve acreage, MRW partial reserve acreage, moved into the CRW around that Palouse Creek area. So that covers it. There are some additional changes that we're making specific to, and we had a meeting with the subgroup or a subgroup of the board last Friday on this. So back in April, the board, you all vetted at the retreat the issue of removing acres from the occupied murrelet layer that are less than 65, and through the research proposal, OSU had identified as, hey, these shouldn't be in the occupied layer. And then subsequently the new LiDAR data revealed that there were more acres less than 65 years old in the occupied layer for murrelets, which would prevent future harvest. So we're pulling acreage less than 65 stands out of the occupied layer. We're shifting on, because of that changes the biological goal and objective numbers that's in the draft HCP. And related to that, there's a metric around how to measure for potential murrelet habitat, how to measure whether that acreage is serving as quality habitat over the 80-year permit term, that we're doing differently than a quantified X amount of numbers of acres. It's a weighted index acre. It's a lot of detail I won't get into here, but we wanted to vet that with a subset of the board. And then there are some, I mentioned there are a couple pending things, and one, or in that arena, are some revisions requested through consultation that DSL's had with the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, and those are, we're working on processing revisions there, some of which some are harder than others in terms of making sure we are keeping true to the research proposal that the advisory committee thumbs up and the board voted on and was run through the land board, that is voted on and was run through the legislature, and also keeping the wheels on the bus with getting an HCP or take permits under the HCP. So there are some modifications that we feel like can be made related to tribal requests that, come from the CT Klutzy, but I think are really related to how this HCP speaks to indigenous peoples and tribes. So those are the three that we vetted last week with the subset of the board. And I don't know if anybody who was there wants to say anything about it, but those would be the additional things not on the screen here. And that package of things is basically what we need to do between now and the time the revised HCP is handed over to the services in early September.
Thanks, Brett. And again, lots more detail, trying to keep this at a high level on this as an update topic, knowing we've got a lot more to cover, and we've spent a fair amount of time with you all and with a subgroup on this, and there's more to come. With that said, Bob, looks like you've got a question. And then Paul.
Yeah, first of all, I just appreciate all the work that's done into it. I know it's been a lot of work that people didn't expect to have to do at this point in the process. That being said, I think it's seems to be on track. I think the hard thing, though, at the end of the day, which I had a good handle on 6 months ago, but I don't feel like I have a handle on now with this, is exactly what does this add up to at the end of the day. There's a lot of moving pieces, and I expect OSU maybe has the same concern, because there's a lot of sort of flexible space in this that could wind up being one thing or another at the end of the day. And when I think about it from a murrelet perspective, I still have a hard time sort of understanding kind of what the bottom line is. I'm not sure I could ever articulate right now to anybody, this is what we know is being done for murrelets, this is the delta that could happen above it, but may or may not. I don't expect that to be answered today, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Thanks, Bob. Paul?
Yeah, I just want to remind the group, Brett brought it up that, we gave a thumbs up to the plan that's in place. That thumbs up was based on financial expectations. So that thumbs up can go away. And I, you know, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but that thumbs up is based on the whole agreement. And I think it's real iffy at this point.
Thanks, Paul. Okay,
Yeah, likewise. And Paul, I think, I hear it, maybe just to say it again, the revisions that DSL is moving forward with in the HCP have not been intended to address all the things that members of this prospective board and others have brought up around resolving financial viability. And so that part, while we're moving forward with the HCP, because we need to keep on the timeline if we're going to satisfy the statutory direction, there is that conversation that you're keeping well centered around the financials.
thanks, Brett. Shannon, I'm going to keep us plugging along and have you turn to the FMP.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So on the FMP, as I mentioned in the timeline update, we are working on incorporating the HCP revisions and updating analyses based on the information that Brett just did an overview on. So we have information from DSL and ICF. We're continuing to get updated information that we can work with in our analyses and into the forest management plan. Alongside that, we are also continuing to work on section development and chapter development. So that includes fleshing out the background information from what was in the November 2022 working draft, updating additional sections on harvest and operational planning, all again related to the conversations that we've all been having as a group and the adjustments in the HCP, as well as working in the chapter on governance structure, research implementation planning, and forest health. And we're working on sharing updates to those sections and chapters along that timeline that we talked about at the beginning of this meeting. As far as future public meetings and information sessions, there were 2 noted on that timeline. One is in August, and we're looking right now at either August 8th, 9th, or 10th. We're working on finalizing that date. And we'll have that available shortly. And then another session in September, the week of September 18th. So we will be sharing that information, the details about those dates. Those will be virtual meetings, and we'll be posting that information on the OSU and DSL websites, as well as through the mailing lists that people have signed up for updates on the Elliott. As I mentioned, we'll have a public comment period in October that's going into development of the final FMP and the final layout ahead of the OSU Board of Trustees meeting in mid-December and the State Land Board meeting in December.
Questions from the prospective board? Comments? Okay. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Shannon, so is there a time point somewhere where the entire FMP would be presented to the prospective board for us to review?
The full FMP we're working on having ready ahead of that October public comment period. So we're looking at late September, early October for that full version.
Okay.
But if you have specific comments or questions in the meantime, or want more information on any of the sections in addition to what we're sharing prior to that, I'd be happy to work with you on that too.
It's always nice to have the full thing so you can compare, one chapter to the next and be sure things are tying in, flowing well and all. So
Absolutely.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I see others heads nodding as well. Jennifer?
Yeah, I was I'm wondering if it also might be possible to share whatever you're bringing into the listening sessions prior to October, just to make that available to the board. Like, I don't know what information is being shared there. It just might be helpful for all of us to also see the same the same information that the public is going to be, we're going to be listening to the public about.
Yes, absolutely. And that's our intention, to share information with the board as well as the public. So we'll make sure that you get that information directly too.
Thanks, Shannon. All right. Not seeing any other hands up. Bill, we'll ask you to give an update on the carbon RFP.
Great, thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so as I'm sure you're aware, the state issued an RFP for looking at carbon potential in the Elliott State Research Forest, and we received 3 qualifying proposals. The proposal review panel consisted of Dimitri Palmatier from the Treasurer's Office, Jeff Huntington from the Governor's Office, and myself. And we selected a contractor. The contracting firm is called Anew. They're a firm from California with extensive experience registering and marketing carbon credits in both voluntary and regulatory markets. The next step is to to negotiate and execute a contract with Anew. We hope to have that done in the next 2 weeks. We've got a meeting about that on Thursday. And as you'll recall, there were actually 3 phases for the contracted work. Phase 1 is a carbon market assessment report, really a feasibility study to determine the quantity of carbon credits that might be generated and what the value of those would be in both a voluntary and a regulatory market. Phase 2 would be actually the decision to market and to enroll and certify those credits. And then phase 3 would be the actual sale of carbon credits. And so that phase 1 carbon market assessment report will be completed within 60 days of contract execution. So we're looking at late September or early October to have that actual report in hand. We will have a preview of the numbers, meaning an estimate of how many credits and their value to share with the board prior to that. And we plan for an overall board discussion in October, which will inform the decision to move forward with phase 2. The land board is also looking for an update on the research forest in general, including the HCP and FMP status, as well as financial viability at its October meeting. And since the carbon RFP results will help inform that financial viability picture, the phase 1 update will also be part of that land board update. And then ultimately the decision for entering into phase 2 lies with the land board. And then the decision for phase 3, which is the actual sale of carbon credits, will lie with the board once it's official the beginning of the coming year.
The authority board.
Yes, the Research Forest Authority.
Yep. Thanks for the clarification. Thanks for the update, Bill. Colin?
Yeah, hey, so I've raised some concerns in the past with the carbon marketing, and I'm still concerned that the carbon marketing is proceeding without any real involvement of the board. And I've asked in the past, involvement of the board or OSU really. I've asked in the past that we be provided with a copy of that RFP for review and comment before it go out, which we didn't receive. But I wanted to ask again, can we get a copy of the RFP? And can we also have an opportunity to review and provide comment on any contract before it gets inked?
We certainly can share a copy of the RFP and also the proposal that we received. The contracting decision is really one that the department is making, and we're moving forward on that contracting for the phase 1 and a piece of the project. So I think we could certainly share that, but I don't know that that we're going to change our decision based upon input from the prospective board regarding the actual entering into that phase 1 feasibility study.
Yeah, and so to clarify, Bill, that phase 1 is simply a feasibility study, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I mean the contract would be you would have terms that would look at phase 2 and 3 as well, but those would not be triggered until a later decision.
And that decision you're referencing, Bill, would be a decision by the board, the authority board at that point.
The decision to actually sell credits is specified in Senate Bill 1546 to be the board's, the Research Forest Board's decision.
On the timeline real quick, oh, sorry, I don't, Vicky, I'm sorry to jump in front of you. On the timeline really quick though, you'll see in there that the October board meeting, which is when there would be information back from the contractor about feasibility related to both at least one voluntary and at least one regulatory market. That October board meeting is when we've kind of flagged or marked a big conversation amongst this board related to the carbon policy question. And it would be, you know, based on, the reason for the timing is so it could be based on information that comes back in addition to, you know, whatever anybody here is already currently thinking about carbon.
Thanks, Brett. Vicky?
Yeah, I just want to say that right now, the Elliott is owned by the department. It's been decoupled so that we don't have to make money and send it to the Common School Fund because that obligation has been met. But the forest is still in the department's hands, and I was given the direction to inquire about carbon, to put out an RFP about carbon, and to make decisions about carbon up through phase 2. The phase 3 is up to the authority board. So that's why you all weren't included in developing the RFP. And I suspect you won't be included in the contract that we have for going forward on developing phase 1. So I just need to let you know that.
Tom and then Mike.
Thanks, Peter. Just curious, is there, I can't remember, is there any obligation, oh, I was lowering my hands. Is there any obligation to the firm to pursue stage or phase 2, or is it completely open? Like if the assessment is done and it's decided that it by DSL, because apparently it's not in the board's hands at this stage. Are you under an obligation to move forward with phase 2 in any way? I thought the contract was written, I couldn't remember, or the RFP was written in such a way that it implied that it was for, and I can't remember how it was written, Bill. Maybe you could just give us a refresher.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that question, Tom. And there is no obligation to enter into phase 2 or phase 3. And that was very clear in the RFP from the beginning. So the intent is to do this market feasibility study, use that information to inform the decision as to whether to actually register the credits. And so that's, and when, you know, registering the credits means, you know, doing the timber cruises, doing the assessments of how much carbon is present, what's the likely growth of carbon over time based upon the management plan. So that's a pretty extensive process. And then once you have that information, you actually register with one of the carbon market registries. Then the third, you know, phase 3 piece would be the actual marketing of those credits. And so there'd be a decision first to enter into phase 2 to actually do the registration of the credits, and then subsequently a separate decision to actually market and sell those credits.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the question, Tom. Mike, then Jennifer, and then Paul.
Yeah, thank you. So Vicky and Bill, it would be nice for the board to once the contract is put together to be able to see what that contract says, because if we end up going down towards phase 3, we'll be the one that actually makes that decision and implements it. So, and it would be in a contract that's already signed by somebody else other than the board. So there's a little bit of a little disconnect there, and a little, I think, I'm sensing some heartburn amongst us, those of us on the board, a little bit about that too, and that the contract will have already been signed And the terms of it will have already been made by the time we get to the point where we decide if we're going forward or not. So it would be good to have a copy of the contract once it's put together.
We can certainly do that.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Bill. Jennifer?
Yeah, picking up on just what Mike was saying, I think is that recognizing where the decision authority lies at this point, which is with DSL, but I think even just having the opportunity for meaningful input or feedback or commentary from the board might be helpful as you go in terms of seeing the contract, but also if there is a phase 2 decision, it seems like it's an opportunity for us to, as a board, to be able to, be engaged regardless of where the decision authority lies at this point. So just really picking up on what Mike said.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I do want to also just, Paul, I see your hand. I emphasize also some of the comments that Tom's made in the past and others have echoed in terms of the need for a more robust conversation about carbon markets and whether and how that, the implications associated with that for a research forest and public forest, et cetera. So we are clearly tracking that and know that this board needs time to interface with each other about that topic. So that said, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm given the number of subcommittees and committees, and I'm fine with DSL pursuing information to provide us about carbon credits, as long as we have the ability to say, no, we don't want to sell carbon credits. We don't think that that's a real market. And we don't think it's the best choice for the Elliott. But information's good to have, and quite frankly, I don't have the time to get involved in too many more committees or conversations about this, that, or the other thing. So get us the information, as long as this board or prospective board that will be a board has the ability to say, no, don't want to do it, then I'm fine with it.
And I'm absolutely ditto with Paul.
Thanks. Anything else on the topic of carbon before we turn our attention to a brief update on Shutter Creek? Okay, and Bill, can you make sure to get Jenna the RFP so we can make sure to circulate that?
Will do.
Thank you. Brett, Shutter Creek.
Okay. I feel like this meeting needs a joke to lighten it up, but I don't have one on Shutter Creek. Shutter Creek's no joke, and it's moving forward. I think the upshot of this update, and Vicky and I were going to tag team this a bit, is August 1 has for a while, ever since DSL back in 2022 put in an application to, after the prison facility was mothballed at Shutter Creek, conversation around, hey, could this be an connection to the Elliott State Research Forest through a facility or infrastructure related to OSU research, dorm space, staff for the authority, headquarters for the authority, and potential partnerships, including with the CT CLUSI and others. That application that DSL put in 2020, in June of 2020, set in motion a process to shift the facility from a deeded property from the federal government to Department of Corrections for a prison facility to instead a deeded property to Department of State Lands for wildlife conservation related property. And that there was an August 1 deadline that has long existed around the decision point to keep things moving forward on that deed transfer or not. And so we're up against that deadline. And I think based on all of Vicky, I'll let you speak the intentions, but there have been a series of conversations with the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Mquon, and Siuslaw, as well as with GSA and local government around the cell tower and making sure that the cell tower that's used for communications on the coast, including emergency communications, is kept intact and functional. We've got paperwork in place with GSA that can document and assure that. All signs are pointing forward. And so, Vicky, I'll turn it over to you to take from here, and then I could fill in around any edges. But I think we're at a mark point on Shutter Creek that, to be clear, needed before there are people up there staffing the research forest, or OSU or any partners around redevelopment and vision plan for the site. But we are at a mark point. So Vicky.
Yes, thank you, Brett. You are correct. We've had a couple of consultations with CT Klutzy, and I understand they met on Monday of last week. I'm kind of topsy-turvy on my dates because I was in and out a lot, but they had a separate meeting to talk about what their vision is for the property, so that I have a better understanding of how we might partner. They're the only tribe that has reached out to us in terms of a desire to have a presence on that site. I anticipate hearing from the tribe again this week because I need to sign those documents. It's my intent. It appears that it looks like we're prepared to sign. I just would like to know a little bit more about what the tribe has in mind. We are looking at, and part of that is to know what we need to do, a development plan for the site. We have money from the $4 million HUD grant that is going to pay currently, as soon as we can start accessing the funds, the security on the site, as well as the monthly fee. The sewer fee alone is $16,000 a month. I need to reduce that because that's not sustainable. And the reason the cost is so high is because of all the existence of the buildings and an agreement that the Department of Corrections entered into with the city of Lakeside that expires next year. So I'll be looking at renegotiating that agreement based on what our development plan is. I'm also going to reach out to the city of Lakeside and provide them with information about how to access funding from USDA Rural Development that I used to run in Oregon, because they have low interest loans for smaller communities to upgrade their water and sewer systems, which is something I understand they want to do. But there's no reason for us to pay $16,000 a month. What we would anticipate doing, OSU has targeted a couple of the buildings that they would like to keep. They certainly need renovations or either total demolition and reconstruction. So I don't yet know how that would play into it. I do know that the governor indicated to Jeff Huntington that we should come back in the February session and look for some construction funding to continue with this work. So some bonding. So we're going to look at that. Right now, it's just signing the documents, and it's been a little bit of a chore because the back and forth between the GSA attorneys and our DOJ, and then in terms of what they're going to allow to be the allowed use on the property, we had to pull out the original application when we were getting some pushback and say, look, you approved this purpose and these things from this application. So they backtracked and said, okay, we approve that. So they gave us some other ways to get this information in the document. And that's what Brett has been working on with our DOJ counsel. And we're pretty darn close. I believe our final messing around with the language goes out this afternoon. So I know my deadline's August 1st, which I'm not sure. I think August 1st lands on the weekend. So I want to get it done this week. Oh, August 1st is next Tuesday. So I have until next Tuesday, but we'll see. But that's sort of where we're at. I can tell you that the CT Klutzi tribe indicated they would probably just have their natural resources folks up there and not anyone else, but I don't know yet because I haven't heard back from the tribal council on what all that entails.
Yeah, I think that's the gist. I mean, I don't, if folks have any, the one other little thing to add, not little, but relevant is, you know, this is managed as a wildlife conservation property now, and to a lot of people that might mean a wildlife refuge, and to anybody that's ever been to Shutter Creek, there's a lot of hard footprint up there. There are things that the intent would be to basically take over. There's a murrelet management plan that Department of Corrections has put in place in response to the uplisting, the state uplisting of marble murrelets from threatened to endangered. And for the portion of that 49 acres that has habitat on it, the state would, DSL would take over that plan from Corrections. But we wanted to make clear that for the hard footprint on the site, all the buildings, that even though the new purpose of management up at Shutter Creek would be wildlife conservation under a legal program title, that should not be, there should not be an expectation that the whole property is a wildlife refuge, and instead, to be consistent with the application that was approved by GSA, we wanted to make clear that the intent is for facilities and infrastructure related to the Elliott State Research Forest and development of partnerships and advancement of partnerships, not just with OSU, but CT Klutzi and potentially others. So
That's correct. And there's not a need to keep all of those buildings for those purposes. And we're just trying to reduce our footprint. And whether some of those buildings are rehabilitatable, I don't know. And that's what we would get an assessment done in the development plan to get an analysis of the buildings that we've targeted. I don't want to get an analysis on buildings we don't want because that's a waste of money. So we're trying to narrow down the buildings we're looking at specifically, and then DSL would own those and charge lease payments.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Brett. Any brief questions or comments from the board? All right, why don't we take a 10-minute break? Come back around 2:05 and we'll continue the conversation with startup funding. Thanks much. And Keith, just so you know, your camera's still on, just making sure you know. All right. You are back. Well, appreciate if you could go briefly on camera at least, and we'll get started when we see that folks are, the majority of people are back. All right, Brett, you're up first with a brief update on the legislative session and bridge funding.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. The legislative session concluded after looking like it may not conclude well. It actually concluded fairly well, and part of the outcomes were passage of 161, which extended the, I mean, it was the deadline bill, essentially extended the deadline for compliance with the enabling actions that Senate Bill 1546 required in order to create a research forest and authority, a board, and a new state agency. It extended the enabling actions to December 31, 2023. And so for a while there, the bill had passed the House and was hung up in the Senate, who wasn't meeting. And eventually the Senate convened and passed the concurrence bill, and out it came. It was signed by the governor in time to meet the the July 1 deadline that was in Senate Bill 1546. So it was squeaky for a while, and thanks to everybody who had a hand in helping. And essentially what it means is we now have until December 31st to do the things that we were on the hook collectively to do by July 1st. And I think you all know what those are. But the other pieces that came out of the session are funding related. And so there was a little bit of money in DSL's budget bill, which relates to some future availability of funding that we didn't, I mean, I think it's safe to say, Vicki, Bill, we didn't go into the session planning on, but related to some capacity related to the Elliott, including wildfire costs over the next biennium. And then in the Christmas tree bill, or the omnibus bill, to wrap up the session, there was funding that through work related to LFO in the legislature, as well as governor's office, treasurer's office, and individual legislators and you all through support. We have a budget. We have budget funding. It's an 18-month budget for the authority that provides just over $4 million in funding for the period of 18 months, starting on January 1, 2024. And so essentially that money is being held. It's not at DSL, it's being held for the authority when the authority becomes a real legal entity. And what I was going to do here, Peter, is pull up the material we circulated in advance of this meeting on that bridge budget. And so you can all see what, when DSL was working on advancing this, we were given a short turnaround timeline around, okay, show us what a budget would be and what the line items would be. And we gave it our best shot based on where the budget conversations with the Prospective board were at the time, and knowing that there wasn't unlimited funding available. And so I'll pull that up as to where it landed. But as I do that, I think those are the main outcomes from the session. And the bridge budget relates to the startup costs, which I think we wanted to get into a little bit more in this agenda item. Because there's, on the other side of what happened that's positive this session, there's always what didn't happen. And there's a good chunk of startup cost money that's needed to make sure the Elliott Research Forest boat floats. And that's on the horizon still, and it's going to take some work. But Bill, Vicky, did I miss any? I'll pull up the bridge budget because I think this relates to some of what we want to talk about here, but did I miss anything coming out of this session? And then I
no.
also wanted to put a pin in it for, I don't know if Shannon, you've got any update from Katie Fast, or if OSU has any session related highlights.
Well, first off, I just want to say you nailed it. However, I will say, boy, that's a good cucumber. I went out to my garden during our break and got cucumbers, carrots, and tomatoes to eat. So anyway, the joyful surprise was the bridge funding ended up being general fund. We rarely get general fund from the legislature, and I had called all of the education beneficiaries and asked them if they were okay with it coming from the Common School Fund. And they begrudgingly said yes, but you know, the ATM is now closed. And I said, okay, I got it. So I had their permission to advocate for that. But the legislature had other ideas and gave us general funds. So I have to tell you, I was absolutely thrilled with that result. And I think it was really good for you all to have some funding to start with. You are going to need, I do believe you're going to need to plan some early term timber harvest, because 4.1 million won't get you too far. It gets you 18 months according to the scratch budget we put together, but that's all I've got on that point.
And if we have comments about that, last suggestion there from Vicky, Paul, was it on the harvest topic? Sorry, you're muted.
I just wanted to know if there was direction on how that money was to be spent. You said it was the authority's money. Is it up to us to target that money where it needs to go, or was there direction in the legislation or the appropriation as how that is to be spent?
There was no direction in the bill other than the budget that we proposed. We gave a proposed budget and here's what we're going to spend it on. I'm assuming there's some flexibility, but I see our CFO is on the call and we have a meeting with her tomorrow or Wednesday to talk about all these things. So I might have a different answer for you after that call, but at this point, I think it's flexible for how you wish to allocate it.
I'll stick with the original answer until I hear otherwise.
Yeah, I thought that might be the
Good
case.
call.
Good. Shannon, anything you'd want to add from sort of the OSU perspective on this?
No, we don't have any other updates on the legislative session.
Okay. Then
Okay, so here's what was presented as the budget back in May. And again, I mean, Paul, what you're getting at is it's part of the awkwardness of this overall enterprise, where we're working on a project where DSL is doing things as the lead agency because we are the agency that is connected to and has jurisdiction over the forest right now, but with the same time knowing that the pathway is come January 1 different and it's to hand it over. And so this is knowing that the budget conversation on the revenue side and the cost side isn't stay back in May, and we're all still working on sorting it through. This is what was submitted, the $4 million, roughly $4.1 million budget. Where it landed is somewhere, 100,000 shy of this, around the 4.0 something. So you'll see the money is there for an executive director hire, an executive assistant hire, and then a policy analyst, operations and policy staffer who's budgeted in here at a halftime of 0.5 FTE. And then the bulk of the 4 million is tied into personal services. Big line item is line item 4,300. It's the operations and research, the assumed agreement with OSU, and we made some assumptions. I'll try to move the bar here. Let's see if I can get this to collapse. We made some assumptions around what would go into the, roughly 3.4 million tied to the startup bridge for the operations and research. And you can see some of those here around, lead manager, forester, forest engineer, and then research lead as well. So staffing, and then money for equipment. This is not everything that's in, Shannon, I guess just to verify, this is definitely not everything that's in even the most recent scaled back budget from OSU though, right?
No, it's not. As Brett said, DSL put this together on a pretty tight timeline with the information that was available at the time, and then shared this budget with us. And since then, Brett and I have had a lot of conversations, and there's been more work done on the budget. This as an 18-month bridge budget equates to about a $2.26 million budget for the research forest operations.
When you take it annually and not
When you
spread
take it
over
annually, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know how much longer folks want me to leave this up here. I guess the takeaway might be there is a chunk of money. Shannon's kind of broken it down into what it would actually mean, and on an annual basis. And I think there are some assumptions that, like Vicky said, DSL can wrestle down on how much fungibility there is to move money across budget lines in here. I think our starting place is, we assume there is, and because we don't feel like there's legislative direction to the contrary, but where this prospective board, I think this is really to the discussion piece, where you all want to prioritize spending money, and as you think about ramping up from where we are now to where you want to be in January, to then the first hires out of the gate and entering into an agreement with OSU, and or entering into spending money in other areas. I think this is part of the coming soon to a theater near you. Like, this is the reality that will be in your laps as full authorized board members, and what Keith was getting in at the beginning of the meeting. Like, this is all going to get real pretty fast, and there's real money that's being held for the authority. And so I think the overall point of this agenda item is to have you all talk about how you want to be set up, and starting here with startup costs are at a $4 million 18-month budget, but pretty soon there's going to be a new session come January, and there's been an invitation or an openness to hear about an increased level of funding for the authority beyond what was done this session. There's also a recognition that we've got fairly significant startup costs that are uncovered, and some of those relate to Shutter Creek as a capital project, but other startup costs relate to the operations and the research side. And I guess, Shannon, we can't tell you where exactly there are asks in at the federal level for additional federal appropriations beyond what OSU and DSL have pulled out of the hat to date, or I should say with our Senate delegation's help, pulled out of the hat. We've got, I think, three asks in from DSL and one from OSU, and we should know more, I think, in the coming months as to whether we're going to have success in landing any of those, and if so, how much. And that can add to the startup costs or shift the startup cost delta into looking more complete and funded. But there will probably be, on our August meeting agenda, we've got an item related to startup costs, and Shannon and I will work with our teams around bringing forth startup cost kind of funding spreadsheet or budget that we've got in draft form right now, and that'll help explain a bit more of where it feels like the needs are. All of this, though, assumes that there's going to be between now and December a focus of this board on or a capacity and staff at the staff level and working for what a startup fund ask would look like. So the legislature continue to ask for federal money and then potentially bringing resources, including timber harvest, and how those project out over the course of the startup cost term between now and 2027. And then you all would be the legal authority in 2024 and needing to be, somebody needs to show up in the session to be working this forward. And so that in turn relates to how you all get teed up with an executive director and a board chair and the like. So I'll stop there and probably, unless anybody wants to keep it up, pull this
Yeah,
budget
I think
down.
that's right, Brett. So let me take Keith and then Vicky and then Paul. Oh, sorry, Keith, you're on mute yet.
Actually, I actually muted myself. I was unmuted. So for Vicky and Brett, then, so with a $4 million startup cost, then the assumption is that harvest revenues in the first 18 months will then be banked by the board to pay for operational costs beyond the 18-month time limit. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that's the assumption. I mean, Vicky, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the notion of the startup costs. We had to work within an 18-month window based on when the authority was going to be legally authorized and when the state biennium ended. But the assumption around the startup costs has been those costs need to be filled. That bank account needs to be filled up beyond a term of one biennium or beyond 18 months with funds that are going to come from other places than timber, because the timeline, the soonest that it feels like revenue from timber harvest could come in based on the amount of time it would take to generate a contract and to issue and then process or advance the work and then generate revenues back from the contract would be 2027.
So we would need then another 18-month, or the board would need another 18-month funding mechanism to get us to harvest revenues.
I think it's safe to say that the board will, the authority in the board will need to be back in, aside from the 2024 short session around how you bump up the money that's there, in the next long session in 2025 for the next biennium, that budget would be relevant to operations, research, and then the authority, the administrative budget for the agency. And I think it's safe to say that the legislature will want to know when it can expect harvest revenue to be coming in related to the SB 1 or 1546 financial self-sufficiency directive.
So
Right, but I was assuming that your 2027, you mentioned 2027 as a potential earliest date for harvest revenues and with contracts and all to carry out. So if we got 18 months, that gets us halfway through 2025, 18 months more gets us to 2027. So beyond this startup revenue, then it sounds like there's another 18 months of bridge revenue to get us to harvest, to get us to the board, the authority being able to pay bills through the harvest that it has just done. I think I have that right. Does
Yeah,
that seem correct? All?
I think you've got it right too. And I mean, I would turn to whether Bill,
Yeah,
Vicky, or
so-
Shannon or anybody else you
Let
think
me-
different.
Brett, let me just very briefly give a chance for Shannon to weigh in. And Keith, you're flash forwarding to the next agenda. It's great. It's a little bit of a flash forward to the next agenda topic and some of the timing on this stuff. So Shannon and Paul, it looks like you're on there too. Either of the two of you or both of you, if you want to chime in here, and then Vicky, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, let me just interrupt because I've been communicating with Michelle Lisper, our CFO analyst, and she's willing to answer some of these questions, which I think can be helpful. So if you want to wait for Shannon and Paul, then we'll ask Michelle to answer some of these questions. It's up to you.
Yeah, let me go to Shannon and Paul, and then Michelle, we'll see if we can feed you it. And then Paul, I know you've got another question. Maybe we'll have a chance there after that. Go ahead, Shannon.
I'll turn it over to Paul Odenthal, but just wanted, in response to Keith's questions, this is relating to how the startup costs and funding have been planned to date. So the work that we've done and that is continuing to evolve, but the main plan that was discussed with the advisory committee and this board was to have basically 3 years of startup costs covered by other sources of funding to create time for the forest to get up and running as a research forest. And so that includes being able to hire and contract, putting in pre-treatment monitoring, as well as allowing time for harvest to be planned, for public processes and vetting of plans, and then for the length of the contract for a logger and to work with the forestry team to actually go out and complete the timber harvest and for the revenue to come in. So that's why there's that 3-year delay really in the planning that we've all been a part of to date. It anticipates revenue coming in year 4 in order to create the space for all of that work to happen.
Well, that's that 18 months and 18 months timeline that I was talking about, right? So, okay. But we're still short that second 18 months in bridge funding. Is, I guess Vicky will jump in on that. Anyway, thanks, Shannon.
Yeah,
Before-
Paul, do you have anything?
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I can just add, so Keith, that, the bridge funding that was identified doesn't cover all the costs of the 18 months period as well. It was based on some of the staffing requirements and ongoing costs. There's some larger equipment purchases that need to happen that weren't in that budget as well. And so, but there is also some other funding, right? Revenue that's been identified, like 3.5 million. So there's more. I don't know, I'd have to guess here as well. I think there's more like a $7 million or $10 million bogey of the startup funding, not including the infrastructure piece still out there that will have to be figured out as we go.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll use your bogey, or like, I think everybody needs to hear this whole conversation with a sense of generalities, right? We're using 18 months and big round numbers, and just want to make sure that we're explicit about that so folks aren't scratching stuff down on a notebook that are going to bring out later. We got to work through the details. So with that said, Vicky and then Paul.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna preface this, and Michelle, if you want to make yourself on screen and available to answer questions. So during the budget hearing in Ways and Means, our LFO analyst had a conversation with the committee, and he indicated that the authority would likely be coming back in February for further funding. So it's anticipated this is going to happen, but the hand doesn't get to stay out for long. So when I emailed Michelle asking her if I was correct that we can use the 4.1 million any way you wish, the answer is yes and no. So I'm going to turn that over to Michelle to answer what the yes and no part of that is.
Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Lisper, and I'm with DAS Chief Financial Office. So to address Vicky's question, the budget that was approved as gap funding in general fund does include 3 positions. Something to realize is this authority will be an Oregon state agency, meaning it falls under the executive branch. And those positions for the authority will fall under the executive branch. They're state employees. Now, they do work for the board and how you set it up, but please realize that the budget for the authority is one that still has to be approved by the chief financial officer, the governor going forward, as well as the legislature, like any other state budget process, regardless of where the revenue comes from. So let's say, for example, you have $7.5 million in total funds. Maybe 4 of it is general fund and 3.5 come from other revenue sources. But the authority to spend that budget has to be approved, and you would be limited in during that biennium to spend within those limitations. That doesn't mean you can't come back. February session may be too soon. We have emergency boards that can authorize funding and spending and change of a budget. Personally, I don't know if you're going to spend all that $4 million in the last 18 months of the 23-25 biennium. It will carry forward because it'll be in a specific trust account held by Treasury. So it won't necessarily be general fund, but it will be protected funds if it's not fully spent. Now, as far as the budget goes, the budget was approved based on what DSL submitted. As long as it's within those parameters and those positions, and approximately that, services and supplies are used, I don't think anyone's going to question it. But if there's going to be a big purchase equipment for the general fund, which is a capital outlay or a special payment made, that probably needs to be a report provided that you're revising the budget and the spending plan so the legislature is aware of what changed. So when I say yes and no, within the parameters right now is personal services for basically 2.5 positions. And by the way, based on recent union contract, the cost for those personal services has gone up, if nothing, by at least 6 or 7%. So you've got to take that into consideration going forward for the rest of the biennium. Because there is I think it's 6.5% increase effective January 1 of 24, and there'll be one in 6-something% in 25. So just letting you know what we sit on now. That doesn't mean the budget can't be changed. I'm just saying it's not an open-ended spend totally as you please. There needs to be some parameters and some guidelines on how you expect to use it. And I doubt anyone will complain or object, but they want to make sure that what they approved and what was proposed is how you want to move forward. And if there are major differences, just needs to be communicated.
Thanks, Michelle. Paul?
So this goes to my original question. This budget that was put forward as is to get this bridge funding, has some allocations on it that are described in a manner that the prospective board doesn't agree with. The operations personnel in discussions that we've had need to work for the executive director, and they're listed as OSU positions in this budget. So
Becky, do you want to speak to that real quick?
No, they're not listed as OSU positions. None of those positions are listed as OSU.
it says OSU after the description of the position, Vicki.
They're not OSU positions.
And I will confirm that they are executive branch positions, meaning they fall under the governor.
That's right.
The state of Oregon, not OSU. And the authority is a state agency, not an OSU program, not an OSU side entity. It is a state agency, the authority is.
I think what you're
True.
looking at, Paul, is the spreadsheet that Brett prepared, but OSU doesn't own those positions at all. And
Okay, well, that wasn't.
It's exactly as Michelle has described. Now, those positions, as Michelle said, must be part of your budget. But the services and supplies, you can move around and do what you want within certain parameters. And no capital outlay without going in front of the legislature. You will be a state agency now, and by gosh, you'll have to live like one. And sometimes that's fun, and sometimes it's a real drag. So, you know, you just have to live within the rules.
I just want to make sure our hands aren't tied when we go to negotiate a contract, that we can come up with the best contract for the authority and OSU.
Nope.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing to, I think, clarify what you're getting at, Paul and Vicky? This is a little bit in the weeds from the term sheet or the OSU management agreement conversation. There's Paul, I think what you're getting at is in the professional services part of that budget that I put on the screen. There's funding there for foresters or forestry technicians and things of that like. And I think that's what you're talking about, right? Is that's all budgeted within a fee that would go to OSU for those hires. And I think to clear the air, I don't think there's any question over whether the authority's director would work for OSU or the authority. I think it's pretty clearly the authority. But what I think you're getting at is other staff at the forester level. The assumption has been that all those staff are hired by OSU, and I don't know where everybody is on the board related to this question. It feels like something to talk about during the August 14th meeting we've got, where you've got a notion that, hey, maybe the board doesn't want to have those folks working under a fee agreement tied to OSU. Is that right?
Well, I think Michelle made it clear they're state employees under the control of the governor and the state agency.
Let me clarify, the director and the employee and the assistant are state employees. He's talking about the professional S&S professional service piece, which that's fine. Whatever is contracted, and that's within the budget. Those aren't state employees. Between the authority and the board decide what they need for professional services to be able to do their job. I'm talking about the 3 positions that you're working on right now for the position descriptions and getting state human resources to approve and to get board members buy-in. Those are state employees. Those 3 positions, 2.5 FTE.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the clarification. Thanks for the questions. Tom and Shannon, you both were up and then back down. Do either of you want to chime in on this, or are you good?
I was under the same impression of what Vicky just and Michelle just explained. I think Paul was indeed referring to the service to the foresters, though, and forest management. And Paul, I believe you said that the board agreed that that would not be OSU. I don't think I've ever heard the board even discuss such an agreement, unless you did it when I was not part of the discussion. But as we said from the outset, the research is the management and the management is the research. They go hand in hand, and we always intended to have the forest manager it's written into all the budgets that we've developed to date, that those were OSU, part of the OSU contract. So I'm a little confused, Paul, but maybe you could clarify.
I personally, not speaking for the rest of my compatriots here, I personally have stated at least twice in 2 different of these meetings that I didn't think that person should be an OSU employee, period.
Okay.
In our meeting that we had as a board only to discuss what it was we as a board wanted to pursue, that was what we pursued. Well, that's what we chose, was an executive director that was an employee of the authority. It is not practical to have the operations staff who supposedly work for the executive director being the employee of another entity. We think they also need to be employees of the authority. And this is something we're all going to negotiate, but that was the position that we came up with at that meeting. I just want to, this decision's not being made today. I just want to make sure that we have the decision space.
Okay.
With the language that's in this $4 million that we can come up with what we think is best.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that, Paul. Yeah, because I was not part of that discussion, because I explicitly said as a board member, but as a member of OSU, that I would not participate in the discussion about the term sheet / contract. And so it's a surprise to hear that the board came to an agreement about something so explicitly, connected to the budgeting that we've done and the discussions we've had to date. Recognizing it wasn't a decision, but that it was a discussion. I'll look forward to having those discussions further with the rest of the board. Thanks, Paul.
Jennifer?
Yeah, sorry, I was just gonna, the way you framed it, I mean, we had a discussion about it and it was a smaller group. And I think it was more of a point for discussion as opposed to something the entire board had agreed to. I just wanted to add my perspective on that.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think this highlights, a whole area of work that needs to happen, right? The significance of those discussions around the term sheet or contract are going to be really, really important. Prior to the August meeting, there is a meeting scheduled for the prospective board members to meet for kind of just a general discussion with the OSU team. And then beyond that, we're going to have more time for folks to work through the details of that. So stay tuned on it. I really appreciate you raising it. They are important topics for everybody involved, both the board, OSU, and others. So stay tuned for more on that. Shannon and Brett, is there more you want to cover or need to cover with the board on sort of this general startup funding and the associated sort of board decisions in 2023 and input guidance and decisions in 2024, guidance in 2023 that you want to flag for folks?
Shannon,
Right.
do you have anything?
No, just that there are a lot of these conversations that we need to continue at the next board meeting and in between, including the startup funds, some of the conversations that were flagged today, as well as filling out the bridge budget. Because as you all have highlighted, Brett and Vicky, we have 4.1 million in bridge funding, thanks to the work that you've done with the legislature, in addition to some other funds, including the 3.5 million for research equipment and monitoring. There's more that's needed to complete the rest of the startup funds. Some more to talk about.
Yeah, and Peter, the only thing I'd add in addition to that is the immediate question of there's money and help with the authority.
Hey, Brett, I think you're going to have to go off camera. You're kind of glitching out again.
Shoot. All right. Is that any better?
Yeah, I think you're good. Go forward.
Okay. Sorry, I'll try to figure out. It shows good bandwidth, but what I was saying is, I think in addition to what Shannon said, there's an immediate question of how the board wants to, what we do to help between now and January. And part of the assumptions are,
just to clarify, Brett, when you say we, which we are you referring to?
Staff, self included. So like staff at the DSL end, staff at the OSU end, and anybody working with Michelle at CFO. I mean, basically, one assumption is the board wants to hire an executive director as soon as possible. And if that's the case, then there's a lot of work that needs to get done between now and January 1. And a related assumption is that the executive director would want to have a hand in their assistant. And then the question of, you know, the operations, the OP3 or the PA3 position, you know, what that is. And the assumption is the director, the director would want to have a hand in who that hire is. So at least my working assumption is the board wants to be ready to go on hiring a director come January 1. And so there's a bunch of work that needs to happen. And then the subsequent hires related to assistant and operations staff, PA3 staff would be coming after, but ideally not that long. And so, you know what they say about assumptions, it's just, I kind of like to verify what the board is thinking instead of just assuming that this is the path and this is what the board wants to have teed up for it by staff come January 2024.
Thanks for being explicit about that. Prospective board members, any reactions?
Before you tee it up, we need to have an agreement with OSU. You know, there's no sense in trying to do something until we know what that agreement is.
Hey, Brett, this is Keith. Can you restate that question for me or your point one more time?
Yeah, with the assumption being that, and Paul, I don't know if you feel this way about the executive director, aside from the forestry staff, but Keith, the working assumption being that that the board wants to hire an executive director as soon as it possibly can, and the soonest possible is January. But there could be work done in advance of that to get the process going, including position description and you know, the hire a search and hiring process.
So Paul Odenthal and then Jack. And Keith, if you wanted to chime in there, feel free. I'll get you after Jack. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you're right, Paul, we have to work that out. But I think as we get into discussions of the management agreement, we can hit the ED and the roles and responsibilities up front and work that in parallel together, right? There's no doubt the ED works for the authority. OSU is not disputing that. I mean, we did have a notion that we would like them in our mind, it's a researcher, and it would be good if they had a small FTE to OSU that allows them to do research. But that's a matter for discussion as well. So I think it's something we can work in parallel, understanding that we need to move on the ED soon for y'all, and that as we talk about the agreement, we need to work that part up front.
Thanks, Paul. Jack, and then Keith.
Yeah, just from my perspective, just to answer Brett's question or to make sure he's fairly clear, I do think we need that ED process moving along. And because I think we do want that person hired as quickly as possible. And I think you're also correct to assume that, or at least I would assume as well, that the executive assistant and the operations and policy person that the ED would want to have a hand in those selections. But to the extent that we could get that process loaded up front, we need to do that too. But just that would be my impression on that.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. Keith?
No, I between Paul and Brett, they touched on anything I would have asked or anything I would have pointed out. So I think I'm good. Thanks.
And I'll ask it in the reverse. And if anybody has, so Jack, you were talking about specifically sort of the ED and then the sequencing of those two other staff people. And being ready to move as quickly as possible in 2024 with the hiring of an ED. If anybody has a different opinion, we'd sure appreciate if you voice it now so we can know that and adjust accordingly. Okay. With that, then one more kind of forward-looking topic here, and we're going to turn your attention now. Ryan and Shannon will kind of lead this conversation. Ryan Singleton from DSL, management implementation, the operational examples, and you received a document that outlined some of the sort of thinking behind this, and I'll turn it over to Ryan and Shannon.
Thanks, Peter. I know Brett shared a document ahead of this meeting. Brett, is that something that you want to start the conversation with?
Yeah, I could pull it up and then pull it back down so we can all see each other just to. Does that work? I could help tee up at least the intentions or motivations behind that document. Does that help, Shannon?
Yeah, that would be great if you're able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, bear with me 1 second. If anybody wants to sing a song or make some noise, go for it. Okay.
We can do
All right.
the Jeopardy song. Do, 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 do. There we go.
Not Celebrity Jeopardy, is it? Okay.
No.
Let me, I'll go off screen so I can hopefully be efficient on bandwidth. Okay. So this document is titled Considerations Relevant to Potential Early/2024 Demonstration involving tree explicit about what we're talking about. The intent of the document, and then Ryan, Shannon, I'll turn it back to you all and anybody else from OSU, is in thinking through the startup cost issue, there's the assumption that we've all covered in this meeting today around when timber revenue could likely come in. And I think there's always been this assumption that there's a waiting period where you need to get things in order, including staff hires, but also the planning process in order around the ability to generate revenue from cutting trees. It's not a turnkey thing. And some of the assumptions as well, or some of the conversation as well, has been around not just on the political optics side of people wanting to know when what would otherwise be a currently idled forest is going to start getting into active management again, and when revenue is going to come in, so that people who are being asked either from the federal or the state end can have an answer to their question about, okay, well, when are you going to stop coming to us, and when will other revenue be relied upon, namely timber. Aside from all those considerations, there's some early term, there are a lot of questions and assumptions that exist out there, some related to the financial viability conversations and assumptions, whether it be around species composition and mix or growth and yield. Some assumptions in that arena around financials, you kind of need something on the ground to test in order to know where you are on some of these things. And then there's also around the treatments, it's the Elliott and it's logging. And so there's no shortage of controversy, especially when you're talking about a new form of, or not new, but lesser practiced form of forestry related to the extensives, and how's that going to look on the ground, and how are the restoration thins going to look on the ground. And then there's the whole issue or set of issues around transparency and public process. And as a board, the statute places the authority on the hook for that, but you haven't done it yet. And so part of the question here is how soon, I mean, the big question is how soon does this board want to have a stab at potential demonstration projects that test some of those assumptions or try to get answers to questions or test out the process, for example, around engagement, and doing it not in a full meal deal, but doing it in more of a bite-sized chunk of projects that are kind of discreetly focused on testing demonstration questions and also building trust and changing the paradigm around an idled forest. And so some of the assumptions, there's a question about how you want to be set up for this and when. But some of the assumptions are there's, while things can be set up and done in the meantime, the actual work on the ground will have to wait until the permits are issued under the HCP, which would likely be June of 2024. So there's pre-work. We're talking about pre-work here. And then I think it's pretty clear, and this is more for Shannon and OSU to speak to, but in order to get all the things done that we need to be done in order to set up timber sales, even in a demonstration context, it's a good chunk of work. And OSU is going to be pretty head down focused on the FMP between now and December. And so there's a capacity limitation and question in play. But through the latter parts, so through this table part of this document, the intent here was to sketch out in a stepwise process what would be needed in order to stand up early term demonstration type projects. What would the context be for rationalizing it, and what would we be trying to test or demonstrate, or what would you all be trying to test and demonstrate? And then what are the steps that somebody would need to do around the specifics of harvest planning? And so I don't want to get into those steps because it's really not my bailiwick, and a lot of that I think is in Ryan's mind and probably in OSU's mind too. But I'll stop there. That's really the context, and I can pull this document down whenever needed. Just let me know, Shannon, if you want to go next, or Ryan, if you want to go next. But I think the overall question is whether this board wants to be set up with early term demonstration projects, and if so, how does that work get done? How does the capacity stuff get addressed? And the board can have something to chew on in kicking off a planning process in or a public process in early 2024. And if not, moving forward in this way, like when, I think the question and conversation is related to when does the board expect to see biennial operation plans, and when can OSU deliver on that kind of thing?
Yeah. So thanks, Brett. Helpful context. Paul and Keith, I see it already. What I'm wondering is, would it be okay? I know Shannon and Ryan have some additional sort of context setting for this that could be relevant and helpful before we jump directly into the conversation. Did you have a clarifying question, or can I have you hold your questions or comments until after we've heard from Shannon and Ryan? Good. Thanks, Keith. Paul, you good? I couldn't hear you. You're on mute.
2027 is too long. People are starting to forget about the Elliott. They're thinking that it's never going to produce. There's no reason we couldn't have demonstration projects up in 2024. And we need to set a date and work towards it. If we set a date of 2027, it won't be until 2027. Let's try and get something done to at least show people what it is that we're trying to do. Demonstration projects. You don't need all the monitoring set up for that. So we need to get something done soon.
That's exactly what I was going to say, so you don't have to call on me later.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Paul. Shannon and Ryan, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll revisit the discussion with full Prospective board here.
Yeah, Shannon, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Yeah, I can take it from here and then turn it over to you.
Yeah.
Brett, thanks for walking through what you put together for all of us to discuss today. And it's helpful to have this discussion and get some board input on how we're all thinking about sort of the early implementation and the idea of demonstration projects on the Elliott. I think, from the OSU's team's perspective, what we're really focused on is process and the scoping that needs to be done to set up these demonstration projects and making sure that they would be done in the right order. So the idea behind demonstration projects kind of related to both identifying areas that are appropriate for early implementation of the research program and timber harvest as part of that research program on the forest. But then also as part of the adaptive management and adaptive research approach and starting to test out some of the approaches that are being laid out in the forest management plan, including extensive and restoration treatments in the CRW. So some of the things that we're thinking about and starting to talk about with this idea of demonstration projects is, what are the criteria that we would use to select some of these stands and define some of the projects? And then what's the process that needs in place and the scoping that needs to be done to do that well? And so we've talked about examples in the past. At our March meeting, we had some operational examples. Ryan has talked about some areas that he's identified, and the OSU team has as well, with some areas that Deanne had put together as operational examples. Those were looking at a mix of intensive, extensive, and CRW restoration thinning based on a set of specific criteria and the requests that we had to look at eligible stands in the first 5 to 10 years. Looking at demonstration projects, how we're thinking about it is we need to look at what are the harvest objectives. What are some of the research approaches that we want to test out as part of the overall planning for the research forest, as well as identifying the areas where we are able to begin those harvests based on all the criteria that's in the HCP and the forest management plan. And so with the examples that we've looked at so far and what our teams have been talking about, looking to the MRW partials to test some of these ideas seems to make sense, as well as looking at areas or stands that, based on their current conditions and what silvicultural treatments are projected in the long run, identifying stands that really need restoration harvest or some type of treatment in the near term. So those are the types of things that we're wanting to talk about as far as demonstration projects, but wanting to make sure that we do that we set up this process well. And from our perspective on the research forest, that means having very clear harvest objectives that fit with the research plan, so that we can have early implementation while pre-treatment monitoring is happening in other areas of the forest in the triad, and also making sure that there's a really clear public process. And that's something that Brett alluded to as well. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the key things that I wanted to highlight.
Ryan?
Yeah, thanks. And just let me know, like Brett, I've had a really unstable internet today, so cut me off or let me know if if I start to get choppy here. Yeah, so what I'll do is, I focus a little bit more on some of the timber sale components. I won't get into a lot of details, but yeah, so Shannon's talked a lot about sort of the public process and identifying stands and really looking into making sure the objectives and goals are kind of ironed out before we get too far. But, to me, I think it makes the most sense to implement each of the 3 treatment types, do an extensive, do an intensive, and do a CRW restoration thin. I think that makes a lot of sense. It allows the research forest to cut their teeth on these different prescription types, especially with extensive and CRW thins, as well as maybe answer some of the questions regarding harvest yields, which have been under quite a bit of scrutiny, and there's been issues there. So we're not comfortable with all the yields that we've seen with some of the past inventory days. So I think all those together can be good reasons to move forward with looking at those 3 treatment types. The type of work that needs to be done, kind of office and field, we have to identify stands, identify those units, and that's really one of the I think the most key part of this to be able to move forward, because there's boundary layouts, there's buffers that have to put in, sample marking if that's needed. We have to cruise it, install research plots if that's desired. I have to ID road work needs, haul routes, road prep, road use permits if those are needed. There has to be a contract template that is created that's legally sufficient. We have to get brands, branding hammers, log ticket books, create bid forms, create a whole prospectus and bid package process. We have to do an appraisal. There has to be an RKO review. We have to discuss contract links. So I'm just listing those things to tell you there's a lot that goes into this. I would really like to see as much of that get done prior to the HCP being ready. But the biggest hangup is going to be identifying those units. And if that takes a long time, then the rest of these processes will be delayed. So that's sort of, my 2 cents, and I'm willing to help out any way I can from DSL's perspective, work with OSU, in terms of identifying units or any of the work that this, needs to take place behind the scenes. I can help with all that. It's just, we have to be able to get to some point where those units are identified so we can get some of the on the ground work done. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Ryan. Vicky, and then Shannon or Tom, maybe you can speak to sort of your thoughts on identifying the units and some of the timelines and challenges associated with that. Go ahead, Vicky.
Thank you. Ryan reiterated exactly what we had a conversation about with Dan Newton some months ago, before we went to Elkton for our meeting. Ryan and Bill Ryan and myself were all on a call with Dan Newton, and we talked about this, and we believe this is a good strategy. And Ryan is correct. There's a whole heck of a lot of stuff that needs to be done before you actually cut a tree. And all of that could be done now. There's no sense. I see what Paul was saying too. Why are we waiting until 2027? There's a lot of work that you all could be doing, and I have offered Ryan up to assist in that. So I'm paying the bill, and you might want to take advantage of that for the next 4 months before you become an authority.
Tom?
Yeah, I'll just kick it off and I'll turn it over to Shannon to talk about site selection. First, thanks for the comments, and agreed, Vicky. We're happy to engage and work with Ryan, and I think I really appreciate you offering him up. There's, of course, some questions around where, what, when, how, and of course, we're hiring a whole staff to do this type of thing moving forward. And so, as Ryan's suggesting, there's a lot that goes into it. It is not a one-person job, nor is it a simple job. There's a lot that goes into it, and we recognize that. I think the key here is that we are not expecting to, nor are we planning to wait till 2027. The intent is that we're we're fully up to revenue generation by 2027. It wasn't that we're waiting to implement action on the ground till that was never stated as such. It was that the revenue generation would ramp up over time, and it would take, more like 2 years to get rolling, and 4 years to be fully at, to be to a point where the forest is functioning in a self-sufficient manner. I'm pretty sure we've always pitched it as such. And Shannon, if you want to take it from there and talk about site selection.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And that's a really important clarification. We're not talking about pushing demonstration projects off to 2027. What we are talking about is being really clear about the criteria and the harvest objectives for how you would choose those sites. And then alongside of that, as Ryan was talking about, all the steps to actually get to implementation. And part of the work that's happening in the forest management plan is developing guidance and objectives for the treatments, in particular, extensive and restoration thinning that are different than a lot of the forestry that's happening on the landscape. And so if we're thinking about this as demonstration and exploring methods and using this as a launching point, not only for implementing early the first timber harvest on the forest, but also looking at testing out some approaches or questions and starting small, then being really intentional about what those harvest objectives are is important. And it has implications for how you set up the contracts and what the requirements are for who you would involve. But that's work that's happening as part of the forest management plan right now, and having our collective teams work together on identifying, what could those harvest objectives be as part of this demonstration project idea would be a really great way to make sure that we're being intentional about our criteria, and then being able to select those areas of the forest for the demonstration sites, and then move forward with this whole process that Ryan outlined, as well as the public process that will need to happen with the board.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Shannon. Paul, I see you, and then I'm going to see if there are other board members that would like to weigh in. Oh, Ryan, and then we'll go to the other board members, see if you want to weigh in on this topic. And I will say, Melissa said she unfortunately got pulled away, so she's not available at this point. But Bob and Colin, even though you're not on camera, I'm aware you're there too and want to give you the chance. So Paul and then Ryan.
I just wanted to say, Vicki, thank you for telling us that we can direct Ryan to do these projects. Ryan, you can expect a phone call later on this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I work for anybody. Just give me a call. Yeah, I do yard work. Yeah, I'll build stuff for you, whatever we need to do. I was just gonna make one other point and kind of a question for the board too, is that do we need to have a biennial operations plan done prior to this, or can we move some demonstration projects ahead without that fully being done? I would like to move them ahead before a biennial operations plan is done, but that's a question for the board to discuss. And I just got a message that my internet's unstable, so I'm not sure you heard all that.
We did.
And I'm going to ask the board members either for general feedback and specifically if folks have thoughts about that biennial operations plan, that'd be really helpful to hear from you on.
And the reason real quick, I say that is just because I think that's going to be a long process. It's going to take a long time to do a full operations plan. So if there's something we can get out the door prior to that, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Ryan, for raising the question. Keith?
Yeah, get it out the door. Let's put something on the scoreboard as early as we can, as quickly as we can. So if we need to do that before the biennium plan, then go for it.
And Mike, I saw your thumbs up. Tom, I see your hand, and I want to flag the comment that Brett put in the chat, just that this is the biennial operations plan is also a legal statutory compliance question. And he said, need to confer with DOJ there. And I will amend that comment to say Brett will confer with DOJ on said topic. Thanks, Brett. Tom, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that since Brett's a jack of all trades, he could start working on that biennial operations plan.
I'm not like Ryan. I might have a law degree, but I'm lame in other areas.
Well,
Did
he
I
just
say
found
Brett?
out
I
the
meant
other day
Ryan.
that
I'm
he
sorry.
just found out the other day that we budget him for the next 24 months. That scared the heck out of him.
And Paul, I see
Information.
I see your comment there, Paul Beck, that it's your assumption the projects could be incorporated in a biennial operations plan when it gets done. So something to be considering there. Other board members' thoughts or feedback on this topic, sort of generally or specifically related to the topic of operations plan, biennial operations plan?
I see Colin's hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Ryan's thoughts. It's important to do this, and it's important to do it before the HCP and the FMP are completed. I think that what we learn in selecting and laying out units can help to inform those documents and to make sure we're in the right track and we wind up with something that's implementable. We don't necessarily or might not be able to implement those projects until after those documents have been approved. But I think it's really important that we go through that exercise while those documents are still in development. So if we see changes that need to be made, we can make them before it's too late. Also wanted to add too that if Ryan needs help on the ground down here, we tribe has some capacity to help out. I also think it would be good if it's needed to get a local contractor. If I don't know what Eric Farm's contract entails, but we could either use Eric and his crew or someone else locally to help Ryan as well.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate the suggestion and advice. Shannon, I'm going to direct a question to you and also say to the board members if there are additional thoughts or questions, comments, want to give some more space for that. Members of the public, remember to send a chat. Francis got you if you want to chime in on public comment. Shannon, you touched on this during the timeline piece, but I think it'd be helpful if you could remind folks kind of when you think about, okay, having the criteria and the FMP laid out in a way that would allow for site selection to transpire, what's the timeline? And again, we're not going to write this down in ink, but just generally speaking, what are you thinking of when that might, sort of be able to, when OSU might feel like you would have that type of information or the criteria that allow you to do the site selection?
Well, if we're talking about the guidance and objectives that are in the forest management plan and the near final version that's going out for public comment, that would be late September, early October. And work on those sections is happening between now and then.
Okay, that's helpful.
That seems like a pretty drawn out time frame. I'm wondering, can we get some units to look at and start thinking about how we're going to mark stuff like tomorrow or by the end of the week, maybe?
I think it would be really helpful for a subset of this group to follow up on that conversation after the meeting and talk some more. Colin, if you're available, and Ryan and others.
I saw Colin, you gave a nod. Brian, you don't have a choice. Anybody else want to be a part of this?
And just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that we go out and start marking stands tomorrow, but to talk about the criteria and the guidance and objectives that we're working towards.
And I think there's sort of, you have, it's not quite dual mandates, but they're dual objectives, and that you want to, I mean, I think I sense from all of you that there is a desire to move as expeditiously as possible, but also a desire to be faithful to the research objectives and trying to use these demonstrations projects to advance those research objectives and learn as much as you can. So I think you're trying to balance those things and you move them along simultaneously. So and it's makes sense that those things are a little bit in tension, but I trust that you'll be able to manage both of them simultaneously over this, what is ultimately a relatively, thanks, Jack, short period of time in these remaining months of 2023 and early into 2024. Shannon, you came off mute briefly there. Did you want to chime in one more time?
Yeah, just to circle back on this conversation and reiterate that I think we're all interested in starting to implement the research proposal. I think there's some different opinions about how quickly we can move, and that's the conversation that would be really helpful for all of us to continue together, and in particular between now and the next board meeting. And so that's the point that I wanted to just make sure we circle back to.
Thanks much. Shannon, Ryan, anything else you wanted to flag for the board on this topic? Okay. Anything else from the board before we pivot to public comment? All right. Francis and Peggy Lynch. Well, we'll start with you, Francis. We got you.
Okay. Hello. Oh, I would like to make a comment concerning how you are involving the public in all this process going down. And for instance, I would really like to see an update to the forest management plan as you progress. I mean, we haven't seen anything since last November, and we aren't going to see anything till next October. Can't you just let us know the updates as they go on, publish them on the website? So we don't necessarily have to, not for public comment, but just let us, keep us update on what's going on with the forest management plan. And there's other things that I've heard today that confuse me. It's like, what in the world is an MRW flexible? I've heard of the intensive and extensive, but the public hasn't been told of what the definition of flexible is, or where that definition is, and in what documents it is in. And I'd really like to read that. And one last comment about the demonstration projects and how the public is going to be kept up to date on the demonstration project, since there won't be a biannual plan on that. I mean, will we be notified of where you're going to go? And I'm interested in such things as, like, on the demonstration projects, how are you going to protect endangered species like the coastal martin, that we won't see its protections until the forest management plan comes out. So just, in summary, how does the public, that's not involved in the inner workings here, how do we stay updated with all this information? And could you keep us updated a little bit more regularly? That's it.
Thanks, Francis, and noted on the request. Peggy?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for all the work that you are doing on behalf of the Elliott and on behalf of all Oregonians. I just want you to know that we all appreciate it. I'm with the League of Women Voters of Oregon, and I just have one budget question. So the budget bill was House Bill 5048, and you can go on the legislative website and read the documentation in case you haven't already. That document and the LFO recommendation does state that it is anticipated that the legislature will re-examine the agency's budget during the 2024 legislative session and adjust as needed once the agency has begun operations. So I would think that you should be prepared to do that. The session starts February 5th, but there is an assumption that you will be providing information prior to that for that discussion. So I just wanted to make sure that that was on the table and that whoever is going to be, who are going to be the officers of this new board need to be prepared to work on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Peggy. Appreciate you flagging it, and important considerations there for all of us. With that, anything else from the board? Vicky?
Well, Peggy's right. And I was going to mention that earlier when you all had the conversation about needing to act on your ED. It's really important that you get that in place, because we being DSL are no longer going to be lobbying on your behalf once you become a board in January. You're not our responsibility anymore. So you need to be ready. You need to be ready before January. Bob Salinger knows this very well because he's been at it for a long time. So conversations need to be had with folks way before the session begins, so that you can be ready to roll.
Bills are usually due in November.
Yes.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Vicky. With that, if there's nothing else from the prospective board members, we will call this meeting adjourned, and we'll be in touch with additional your agenda for the upcoming meeting in Reedsport. So remember to let folks know if you need, let Jenna know if you need a hotel reservation. If you haven't already done so, there's the one-day meeting followed by a field tour on the Elliott for folks, and we'll be in touch with the details. Thanks much.
That's Winchester Bay, right? Not Reedsport.
It is Winchester Bay, yeah.
Got it. Thanks for the
check.
correction. I didn't say Peach Bay.
Or Windy Bay if you're a local. All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.